Hello and welcome to this demo where we'll walk through the steps of creating dynamic data-driven test cases using the test data queues in Orchestrator. In this video, we'll explore how to create a data-driven test case using a dynamic data source. So, what is a dynamic data source? It means that we can easily modify our data variations within the data sources without having to modify or maintain test cases. When using a static data source, for example an Excel file, modifying the data variations will require updating the test case to point to the updated file. This is done using the Update Test Data option. However, this step isn't required when working with dynamic data sources. There are two dynamic data sources: test data queues and data services. In this video, we'll focus on the test data queues. But what are test data queues? Test data queues provide a way to store and manage your test data. The test data queue acts as a container that holds your queue items ready to be consumed through a set of activities. The queue items are uploaded or removed from the test data queue according to a first-in, first-out principle. We'll learn how to configure the test data queues as the data source for creating dynamic, data-driven test cases. All set? Let's begin. We'll create a data-driven test case for the WI5 workitems.xaml file, found inside the Acme System1 parent folder, and we'll consider the same use case. For this demo, we've already created the test data queue and uploaded the items in it. Moving forward, we'll be using the acme_workitem_5_queue, and we can see that the items count is 12 for this queue. Let's also look at the items. Here we can see two columns, namely WIID and status. WIID refers to the work item ID, which is type 5 in our case, while the status is showing us the expected outcome for the specific item ID. This means that whenever we have a transaction for the work item ID, we expect to have a completed status for it. Now let's go back to Studio and build the data-driven test case for the WI5 workitems.xaml file. Now let's provide a name and click Next. Here, we'll select Test Data Queue as source and select the queue that we want to use, namely acme_workitem_5_queue. When we use test data queues as the source, items are retrieved sequentially from a test data queue, regardless of them being consumed. We can also see here that we have the option to use filtering. For example, if we want to not perform testing on all of the 12 items in the queue, we can provide a specific range, meaning that we can skip rows and specify how many rows we want to use. Suppose we want to filter 2 rows. Let's add the name. And we want to skip the first 2 rows. Hence, we'll add 2 in the range field, and also the value 2, as we want to work with just 2 rows. Perfect. Let's click Create. As we can see, this creates a data-driven test case. It's critical to note that once we create the test case, we won't see any data variations. This is because it's not yet connected to Orchestrator to fetch the data. Data is fetched from the test data queue only at runtime. You can run and debug files using Test Explorer. Great. Next, let's create 2 variables. One for the work item ID and name it WIID, and one for the status in the queue and name it WI_status_TDQ, and extend the scope as we'll also use them outside the given container. More specifically, an argument of dictionary type specific to the test data queue was auto-generated while creating this test case. This has the work item ID and status that we'll need to extract. Thus, we'll add a multiple assign activity within the given container. Now, inside the To field, let's add the WIID variable and write the following expression inside the Value field to assign the work item ID from the queue to the local variable WIID. Acme underscore work item underscore 5 underscore queue open brackets quotation marks status quotation marks close brackets dot toString. These basically represent the column names available in the orchestrator queue. Afterwards, we can go to the when container, click import arguments, and assign the WIID variable as the input value for the invoked workflow argument. Next, we can add the steps for the then container. Once the transaction is completed, the then sequence logs in, checks the work item status, and verifies if it's equal to the status value stored under the WI status underscore TDQ variable. Perfect! We now have built our test case. Let's go ahead and run it. To do this, we'll just right-click it within Test Explorer and select Run. In the first run, our process connects to Orchestrator and gets the data variations specified as per the filter from the test data queue. Afterwards, it'll perform the transactions. And we can see that our first transaction has started. The first step is to sign in to the Acme System 1 web app. Let's remember that our filter specified that we want to skip the first 2 rows and process only the next 2 ones, namely, our test case will handle only the work item IDs ending in 757 and 762. Perfect, our test ended, and we can see inside the Test Explorer window in Studio that both transactions passed the verification. If we look at the work item IDs tested and the third and fourth item IDs inside the orchestrator queue, we can see that they match as per our filtering criteria. Also, to not waste time testing the same item IDs the next time we run our test case, we can just delete the already tested items from the queue by selecting them and clicking Delete All Items in the Queue button. This means that the only time when we do need to modify our test case is when we need to change the filtering criteria for the queue, or have to point it to an entirely new test data queue. Great! With this, we conclude our walkthrough of using data-driven test cases with dynamic data and orchestrator queues. Here's a quick recap. Test data queues provide a way to store and manage your test data. The test data queue acts as a container that holds your queue items ready to be consumed through a set of activities. The queue items are uploaded or removed from the test data queue according to a first-in, first-out principle. We can use a test data queue in Studio by configuring it as a data source or importing it through activities. All imported entities are stored in the Project tab under Test Data. When you use test data queues as source, items are retrieved sequentially from a test data queue, regardless of them being consumed. Data is fetched from the test data queue only at runtime. Can you recall how you can apply filtering criteria to your test data queue? Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy automation testing!